The cardboard box nearly slipped from my hands when the door opened, and for a split second, the past and present collided so hard I forgot how to breathe. I had come to drop off my ex's things, rehearsed a dozen calm, mature speeches in my head, prepared to leave them on the porch and walk away with whatever dignity I had left. But instead of Rebecca standing there, it was her mother, Margaret, barely covered in a thin ivory robe, her hair unbrushed, her eyes swollen as if sleep had been avoiding her for weeks. The air between us felt heavy with unfinished stories, and I realized nothing about this visit was going to be simple. Before we go any further, if you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the idea that even broken endings can lead to something meaningful, take a second to like this video, comment where you're watching from, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that life rarely goes the way we expect, but sometimes it goes exactly where we need it to. I had driven 3 hours across Ohio, from Columbus to a quiet suburb outside Dayton, with Rebecca's belongings stacked in the back seat of my old Ford. We had broken up 2 months earlier after 4 years together. 4 years that felt like a lifetime compressed into road trips, Sunday church services, family barbecues, and whispered promises about a future we were so sure we would build. But life had a way of testing the cracks you pretend aren't there. My job in construction had grown unstable. Her dreams of moving to New York felt bigger than our small-town plans, and somewhere between ambition and fear, we stopped hearing each other. When Margaret opened the door that morning, she looked smaller than I remembered. The last time I saw her, she was radiant at a 4th of July picnic, laughing loudly, handing out lemonade, teasing Rebecca about how lucky she was to have found a steady man like Jonathan Hayes. Now she clutched the robe at her chest, embarrassed but too exhausted to care. She stepped aside to let me in, and I immediately sensed something was wrong. The house felt different. The curtains were drawn even though it was nearly noon. The television flickered in the background without sound. A stack of unopened mail leaned against a lamp. Margaret moved slowly, apologizing for her appearance, explaining that she had not expected anyone that early. I told her I had texted Rebecca, but she must not have seen it. Margaret hesitated before admitting that Rebecca had left town 3 weeks ago for an internship in Seattle and had not been answering many calls. The words hit harder than I expected. I had convinced myself this visit would offer closure, maybe even a final conversation. Instead, I was standing in her childhood home with her mother, holding the remnants of a relationship that had already boarded a plane. Margaret sat on the couch, pulling the robe tighter around herself, and something in her posture made me put the box down without another thought. She looked like someone trying to hold herself together by sheer will. I noticed a pill organizer on the coffee table and a hospital bracelet tossed carelessly beside it. She finally admitted she had been discharged 2 days earlier after a minor heart episode. Rebecca had flown back for a weekend, then left again for Seattle, promising to return once she was settled. In that moment, my frustration shifted. I had spent weeks replaying arguments in my head, convincing myself Rebecca had been selfish, that she had chosen career over commitment. But standing there, seeing her mother fragile and alone, I realized life had been heavier for her than I understood. Margaret asked me to sit. She spoke about how Rebecca had been torn, how she cried in the kitchen late at night after our breakup, how she believed letting me go was the only way to keep from holding me back. Hearing that felt like someone pressing on a bruise I did not know was still there. The hours passed unexpectedly. I made coffee in their kitchen, the same kitchen where Rebecca and I once danced barefoot while waiting for cookies to bake. I fixed a loose cabinet hinge that had been bothering Margaret for months. I sorted through the mail, separating hospital bills from advertisements. None of this was planned. I had intended to drop off a box and drive away, but instead I found myself repairing small pieces of a house that had once felt like a second home. By late afternoon, sunlight finally broke through the curtains. Margaret looked stronger, color returning to her face. She told me something I did not expect. She said love is not always about staying. Sometimes it is about releasing someone before resentment poisons what is left. She believed Rebecca loved me deeply, but feared becoming the reason I stayed small. I drove home that evening with an emptier back seat and a heavier heart, yet something inside me felt steadier. I had been measuring my worth by whether Rebecca chose me. I had been defining my future by a version of life that no longer existed. But helping Margaret that day reminded me who I was outside of heartbreak. I was a man who showed up. I was a man who fixed what he could. I was a man capable of loving without conditions. Weeks turned into months. I threw myself into work, eventually starting a small renovation business with my friend Caleb. It was risky and terrifying, but for the first time in years, I was building something that belonged to me. I volunteered at church on weekends, helping repair homes for elderly neighbors. Occasionally, Margaret would call to check in, updating me about her health and about Rebecca's new life in Seattle. I never asked too many questions. I did not need to. Then one evening in late October, as autumn painted Ohio in gold and crimson, my phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar Seattle number. Rebecca had written to tell me she was proud of the business I had started. Margaret had told her everything. She apologized for how abruptly she left and admitted she had needed to learn who she was without leaning on me. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden promise to return. Just honesty, simple and clean. I realized then that closure does not always come with a reunion. Sometimes it comes with understanding. Months later, Margaret invited me to Thanksgiving dinner. I hesitated, unsure if reopening old doors was wise. But when I arrived, the house felt lighter. Margaret greeted me warmly, fully dressed this time in a soft blue sweater. Her health noticeably improved. Rebecca joined through a video call, smiling from a small apartment overlooking the rainy streets of Seattle. There was no bitterness in her voice, only gratitude for what we had shared. As the evening unfolded, I understood something profound. Love had changed us both, even if it had not kept us together. We had been chapters in each other's growth stories, not the entire book. If this story is touching your heart right now, please take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and let someone else experience this reminder that endings are not failures. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. And before this story ends, I have a special request. Comment the word "second chances" below if you believe that sometimes losing someone is what helps you finally find yourself. I left Margaret's house that Thanksgiving with a quiet peace I had never known before. The night air was cold, but it felt refreshing rather than lonely. I realized that the image burned into my memory from that first day, Margaret standing at the door vulnerable and barely covered, was not about awkwardness or scandal. It was about fragility. It was about how life strips us down to our most honest selves when we least expect it. I had arrived thinking I was delivering the last pieces of my past. Instead, I walked into a lesson about compassion, growth, and the courage to let go with grace. Rebecca and I never rekindled our relationship, but we found something equally valuable: respect, maturity, and the knowledge that love does not disappear just because it changes form. As I drove back toward Columbus that night, city lights glowing ahead, I felt something new rising in my chest. Not regret, not longing, hope. The kind of hope that whispers that your story is still being written, that heartbreak can be the soil where stronger dreams grow. Life rarely unfolds the way we plan. Sometimes you show up to drop off a box of memories and instead walk into a turning point. And sometimes the door that opens unexpectedly is the one that finally leads you forward.